Welcome, Lynne. Great to have you join us. It's fantastic that you're joining this first podcast of ours, and you have a wealth of experience.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Lynne, let's jump straight in. You were a regulator for 21 years. That's an awfully long time. What on earth made you think when you were younger, I can do that? That's something I really want to get involved in. What was it?
So by training, my experiences in microbiology, so my first job out of undergrad was in a microbiology lab, and I really enjoyed it. And then I was recruited after graduate school to the government. So a lot of my work has been in sterile products and regulating them. So I just thought it was an opportunity to be able to promote, public health on top of using my scientific background and expertise.
That's fantastic. And is it that perhaps motivated you to stay there for so long? Because 21 years is quite a long time to stay in one organisation.
Sure. Well, I really enjoyed working in the government while I was there. I started out in the Office of Generic Drugs for about the first 15 years. We grew significantly because the number of generic applications really increased during that time. Then, as you're well aware, there were a lot of quality challenges and issues that arose during that period of the early 2000s and into 2010 that really involved a lot of sterile products and some quality challenges around them, and kind of developed the culture that we're in now, right? And trying to improve on availability of those types of products and also the quality and safety and efficacy related to them. So I felt that my value added as a regulator was really appreciated, and I enjoyed the group that I was working with as we stood up GDFA 1.
And it's really interesting you say that, because I'm a huge fan of someone called Daniel Pink, and he's a sort of intrinsic motivation kind of theorist, and he very much works on the whole point around mastery, purpose and autonomy, and it sounds like purpose is a really big thing there. I mean, does that resonate with you, do you think?
Yes, it definitely does. Again, I was always very committed to making sure that patients had availability to safe, effective, and high-quality products. So I feel like since I left the organization, that was definitely, more U.S.-centric and focused. Now, as a consultant, I have the opportunity to make more of a global impression there and hopefully help a lot of the clients that we deal with internationally to increase their quality and also the availability of products to patients as well.
Thanks, Lynne. And I just want to take a different perspective now. We've introduced a new feature in our podcast where we have a question from our current speaker and we push that through to our next speaker on the next podcast. Last week, we actually had Pete. He was fantastic, really gave us some insights into his 50 years working in the industry. And he wanted to know from you, what's your most challenging regulatory situation that you've experienced, perhaps while you're at the US FDA or indeed in another role?
Yeah, so there was a lot of challenging situations that I was lucky enough to learn from, but one that comes to mind first and foremost is a consent decree that I was involved with while I was a regulator. There was basically some escalations due to noncompliance that mostly stemmed from quality issues around the manufacturing of sterile products. The facility and the applicant that we were dealing with manufactured hundreds of sterile products, so we knew it would be challenging if there was an issue that we couldn't resolve that would feed into challenges related to drug shortages. So we had a lot of internal alignment meetings to be able to address the noncompliance issues that regulators needed to be aware of, but also to try to course correct if possible and de-escalate the consent decree so that we would not be causing a significant amount of drug shortages, because as you're well aware, there are challenges in Western countries with the amount of aseptic manufacturing capabilities. So we knew shutting one plant down that had a pretty large footprint would significantly impact that. So I always advocate to clients and when I was a regulator that it's easier to do things proactively from a compliance perspective and a lot less expensive or resource intensive because trying to right size for those and remediate things such as warning letters and consent decrees requires a lot of resources, can be very timely, and it can also create challenges that companies have a long time course correcting from, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or with patients and consumers.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? That balance between sort of having a product that's safe and effective, but also making a decision that if there is something wrong, how do you manage that with the supply challenges? And supply, obviously, as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about later, but it's tough, isn't it? I mean, it's difficult work.
It really is. And there was a lot of different scientific perspectives internal to the organization at the time. So it was aligning not only ourselves internally at the FDA, but then trying to work with the company to course correct things. And like I said, keep products available to consumers.
Yeah, and I mean, well, congratulations for continuing your efforts in that area. But I mean, the question that comes to mind is, and you really wanted to stay there for 21 years when you were dealing with those sorts of challenges.
Well, I find them really interesting, and every time I deal with them, I feel like I've learned a lot more from different perspectives. We're trained as scientists, so we look at everything from a scientific perspective, but then when you start looking at them from a business perspective, the financials, the challenging resources, that companies may be dealing with, whether that's personnel, whether that's finance, time, getting products to market and things like that, it really requires a shift between dealing with all those kind of competing perspectives.
Thanks for that, Lynne. I mean, we know that working in the regulator is really challenging. And I think one of the things we're hearing a lot about is harmonization. That's been a topic with regulators for a long time now. And in some cases, we're seeing that that's really moving positively, and we're seeing progress from a harmonization, and we're seeing alignment. And in other cases, we're not. What's your experience? Have you seen elements of harmonization across the regulators?
Yes, I definitely think there's, I've started to see some harmonization, and I think there's a lot more opportunity to expand on that, especially from what we encountered during the pandemic, and to be responsive at a global level to some of those challenges that we might be encountering. I do think that there's some similarities between the regulators and their areas of focus, and that would probably be the easiest or most likely position to start with those harmonizations. I think especially with Western regulators, there has been an intense focus on monitoring quality a bit more closely than we used to, and all of the factors that feed into quality. Some of that is related to, mitigating potential drug shortages, and also, securing supply chain, which again, coming out of the pandemic, was a huge challenge that a lot of companies encountered during that time. I still think that we have a keen focus on data integrity and some of the concerns there, especially from where a lot of our active pharmaceutical ingredients and drug products are sourced from.
Just on that, if I can jump in, I mean, data integrity, is it still data integrity, do you think, or is it data governance? I mean, given that it's been going for like 10 years, it should be the integrity process and principle should already be in place. It should now be, how do you govern that process that's in place, surely?
I agree with you. I think it really is a case-by-case situation, because it should have been in place years ago, but there have been some challenges and that we've worked through, or I've seen as a regulator, and now I'm seeing as a consultant, where there's definitely an opportunity to improve on some of those.
And the regulatory position has shifted on that, I think, as well. It's not so much data integrity anymore, and they're quite aligned on that front, aren't they?
Yeah, I agree. And I also think the more that companies start to incorporate the use of AI and machine learning into some of that, there will have to be some pivots made there. But I think having a robust, quality system will always be critical for companies to be successful. And
talking about the quality system, one of the really big focuses at the moment is obviously the quality function, quality maturity, all of that sort of thing. Where's that come from? Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, so again, I think a lot of regulators want to see that there is a good quality culture within organizations, and that there's a holistic approach to that it's not just in a certain area, but it's really coming from the senior executives and trickles down through all areas of the organization, and that there have been also, some tools used to monitor quality that they're developing or have already implemented. And then there's obviously the quality management maturity pilots that the FDA have run. And I know other areas are also really strong on pushing QMM and making sure that that's a systemic organizational push.
Absolutely. And I mean, just talking about quality culture and QMM, quality culture is an interesting one. I've seen lots of organisations really struggle how to define it. And I think that's an area where certainly if they can define it, and maybe they need external support for that, then they can then move on to understand where they need to go to in terms of their quality management maturity. But just going back to Daniel Pink for a moment, I heard something the other day when he was speaking on another show, and I found it really interesting. He said, turning up actually eats talent for breakfast. And what he meant by that, which I thought was really interesting, was that actually if you're really consistent, you're diligent, you're determined, and you really do just turn up and deliver every single day, then actually it's much better than perhaps misguided focus of talent. Would you agree with that? Would you say that we're seeing that in some of our organisations that we work with, or do you think it is just the fact that the quality culture maturity is just a difficult thing to manage?
No, I would definitely agree with that. I think having a culture where people always have a focus on quality and feel comfortable stepping up and saying something when they see a potential drift away from that is really critical. And that's where you're going to give people the best comfort to be able to discuss those challenges and also address them, to keep their focus really on the operations that they need to perform, and that they're comfortable and well-versed in doing them and have the appropriate training to be able to perform those. And it will make them more comfortable, obviously, interacting with regulators, because it's not just doing it, it's, making sure that people are comfortable kind of walking the walk.
Yeah, and going back to regulators again, because obviously we're trying to take a little bit of a journey around our regulatory system. How do regulators measure culture, do you think? What's their ambition? How are they planning to do that? Because it's a difficult thing to do. It's not something you can just say, well, we've got a measure here we can easily sort of check.
Exactly. And I think there are so many different factors that can feed into monitoring quality. And it's interesting because an example that comes to mind is when I was a regulator and you would get applications, and I'm going to date myself here, but when there used to be stacks of paper applications, and you could almost tell by the name on the jacket the quality that you expected to see in that submission. You could also tell when their regulatory affairs team changed, because the quality would go up or down based on that, kind of like, the industry knows some of the background of some of the regulators who are performing assessment or inspection. You could see the same thing from a regulatory perspective. But what I would say is both from being a reviewer at the FDA, you would be able to see whether submissions were organized, whether the data made sense, whether there were introductions into the data and summaries that would flow well. And then you could almost predict what the investigators would see when they were out on inspection, because a lot of what we saw in the submission would also match and align highly with what we saw in the submission. So you could see that the quality was feeding through, again, whether people, operators were comfortable interacting with regulators or the inspectorate when they were performing an inspection, whether they felt comfortable speaking up, whether there was, a challenge or something that needed to be addressed during the manufacturing process, or when there was a high misalignment, or you could tell that they were very nervous and disorganized and uncomfortable speaking up.
And so they were some of the telltale signs, I assume.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's the key thing, isn't it, for an inspector to be able to go in and identify that. And do you think there are any other telltale signs that are sort of obvious, or do you think they're the main ones when you walk into an organisation for an inspector?
I think those are probably the main ones that people feel comfortable when a regulator's on site. Of course, you do a lot of preparation, and we prepare clients for when regulators come, but they should be comfortable in their day-to-day operations, that they know their SOPs, they have a strong quality management system in place, and they can rely on that. And also, as I mentioned previously, that upper management is also supportive of that. So they're able to interact with regulators in a comfortable setting, provide the information that regulators want to see in a timely manner, and you get a sense that they're not trying to cover up anything or pull any shenanigans. Because my experience as a regulator was that when you start to get that sense that they're trying to hide something, that's when regulators will start to dig deeper, and that's exactly what you want to avoid.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've all seen organisations that are doing really well, that are really quite mature, and then we've seen ones that are perhaps sort of struggling or need a level of improvement. And certainly through some of the work I've been involved in and seen some of our team do, then obviously we've got things like quality management maturity toolkits that really can help sort of progress organisations through that maturity journey. And one of the interesting things that I've seen as well is this whole link with a mature organisation to diversity, equality, inclusion, and it sort of links, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it really links directly to the success of an organization overall. I truly believe that when you have a strong quality culture, your organization will be more successful. You will retain and attract top talent that want to be there and will work hard and will be committed to quality deliverables, and that ultimately will, ensure that any type of products that are being developed or, commercially manufactured for distribution will achieve those critical quality attributes and have that sustainable level of quality management.
And do you think that perhaps where inspectors are seeing some poor levels of quality management maturity, or indeed just the quality function more broadly, that's perhaps one of the things that's led to the US FDA's unannounced foreign inspection program?
Yeah. Again, I'll focus on the U.S. here because that's my primary experience as a regulator, but approximately 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients or finished products are coming to us from basically China and India. So they're a huge supplier to the U.S. And unfortunately, that's where some of the quality challenges have occurred from. And the FDA stood up offices in those two countries to address some of those, and also to mitigate, shortages that the Western countries were seeing. So it isn't surprising to me that they are holding this unannounced foreign inspection pilot out of, focusing on those two countries to course correct and improve quality there. I can also share, an example. When I was a regulator, there was a significant offshoring of manufacturing in the early 2000s, let's say, but decades ago. And there were some big pharma companies that had purchased manufacturing facilities or had moved a lot of their R&D or manufacturing offshores to those regions. And later in my experience at the FDA, we were actually working with some of those larger organizations because they realized that they weren't being successful at changing that quality mindset in certain regions or locations, and then were either, selling off or pivoting some of their manufacturing, going to other areas where they had better quality management systems and a tighter control on their quality being manufactured out of those facilities. So it's unfortunate that, we want to improve on those qualities and the cultures internally, but sometimes there has been a bit of a challenge with those, and the opportunity to course correct hasn't always been there.
That's interesting. And we've talked a lot about culture, and culture is obviously really important as part of an organisation and so on. But what's really important actually is the impact further down the line on the patient, isn't it? And we haven't really talked that much about supply chain and supply chain resilience and the shortages that we're seeing. What's your perspective? It's been going on a long time. We're still seeing shortages now. Do you think it's going to change? Do you think we're constantly going to see shortages as we are?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there have been significant efforts, by regulators to predict those shortages and work closely with industry to be able to predict those and let alone mitigate those. Some of them, stem from, container closure system availability, which obviously is a challenge to always course correct for. But some of those do come from the industry's pivots internally and what they're going to support and not, so they could be a bit more predictable. But I know that they're, unfortunately, they've been lasting now for at least, 25 years now, where we've been seeing significant shortages. I know that, like I said, regulators are taking steps to be able to better predict and mitigate against those. But I do think it's going to take a close partnership between industry and regulators to fully course correct. I also think a thing leading into some of the shortages are making sure that when industry is selecting vendors or partners, that they really have strong quality agreements with those vendors to ensure that they have awareness of what's going on. Because at the end of the day, the applicant is always going to be responsible for anyone that is involved in their supply chain or their manufacturing.
Yeah, and really, really good points. And it's interesting, isn't it? The whole sector's still moving and evolving as all of these problems are still ongoing. And we're seeing technology advancements, they're ever present. They're constantly moving even into the supply chain areas to try and mitigate against some of these issues that we're seeing. And I think what's interesting is we're seeing a lot of AI. We're seeing that coming into, as we say, supply, but also manufacturing. How do you think regulators and the industry are responding to these new technologies? Do you think it's positive? Do you think there's more that could be done?
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity to do more, but I'm also cautiously optimistic about the use of AI because I think the information and data that you feed into that needs to be very clean in order for AI or machine learning to do the best output that it can. From a regulatory perspective, the FDA currently reported recently that they are not using it to perform application review specifically, but I do know that there is a single council that is being organized at the FDA that will assess AI and the ways that regulators can apply it to be most beneficial. From an industry perspective, some industries, or some companies in the industry have really been open-armed to adopting it, but I think there's a broader application that can be applied to it. I think it can be used more to assess all of the data and can, feed into the manufacturing and course correct when that data seems to be drifting. However, I do expect in the next few years to be an increase in the utilization of that by the industry.
And just, again, thinking about the regulatory position, at the moment they're really stretched. I mean, it would be crazy for them not to try and pick up something like AI or other kind of technology advancements that are going to make them more efficient shortly. I mean, there must be other opportunities for them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that there are definitely ways that it can be applied that will be very beneficial, not only to one health authority, but for their harmonization of efforts as well. I know that there is a focus, at least on the FDA side, of the pharmaceutical quality knowledge management system, and that would be a structured format where information and applications is presented in Module 2 and 3 of the ECTD. And that way, then they could share that potentially not only internally, but with other health authorities. And also that would feed into the information that the inspectorate is getting before they go on site to inspect so that they are really focusing their efforts into the high-risk areas during the manufacturing and at the facility. And then lastly, what I would share with some of those AI tools, there are some harmonization efforts with the ICMRA going on, which they will allow for one application to be submitted that will go to several health authorities, and that they can actually have a review, an inspection, and approval on the same day from different regions around the globe. So I know there have been some pilots done there, both from the FDA, the EMA, and then the PMDA. So there have been some success there, and I think that will help stretch thin regulatory resources.
And they're still trying to be progressive by the sounds of it, which is always good. And there's a big reorganization, I think, with the US FDA. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so on October 1st of 2024 this year, they had the launch of the largest FDA reorganization in its history. And the most significant piece of that when it comes to medical products is the creation of the Office of Inspections and Investigation, so OII. And they will be overseeing the inspectorates, and they will have more dedicated or scientifically dedicated or focused technical inspectorates for the different areas. The second largest piece that impacts pharmaceuticals coming out of that is that the compliance responsibilities will be moved into the centers out of ORA.
Great. I think that's sort of really given us a great place to pause at that point. And I just want to thank you. Fantastic to have you on our podcast today. And thank you for joining us. In our next episode, actually, we have Ian White, who's going to be talking all about preparing for inspections and so forth. So hopefully you have a really good question for him.
So, Ian, I know that you have an extensive experience as an MHRA inspector. I would ask, what has been your most embarrassing moment during an inspection?
Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Sam Atkinson. This is Compliance Unlocked. Join us next time for Ian White.